大家好. There was a very interesting situation that happened with me. I went to the inauguration of the president recently, and the president, when he gave his first speech as the new president, he welcomed the crowd. He said, 大家好, 大家好, 大家好. I'm sure my pronunciation is bad. And then he said, nga ai ho. Do you know which language that is? Hakka was before. Amis or Pangca, right? And it was such a funny situation because when he said 大家好, everyone said 好, 大家好, 大家好, and then he said 我好, and no one knew how to respond. Does anyone actually speak Pangca or Amis here and knows how to respond to 我好? No? I'm genuinely curious. I also don't know. But yeah, thank you so much, Aaron, for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here. The campus here is huge, by the way. Took me quite some time to find my coffee. I'm glad that you all showed up here, although I know it's formally vacations now, right? Summer break. But yeah, I'm happy that you are really curious about what I am here to share, and I'm glad that I was invited here. And yeah, first of all, I have to apologize. My voice is a little bit weird recently because, you know, weather in Taiwan is very special, but Taiwanese air conditioners are the worst. And I get sick almost once every month. So I'm here to talk to you about language learning motivations. And I think this is probably one of the best places in the city to talk about this because I know this center teaches a huge range of languages, right? So are there people who are learning perhaps English? I don't know, Japanese? The center doesn't offer courses in Japanese though, right? Korean? No, Ukrainian though, no? I know at least one person here who's learning Ukrainian. Yeah. Why do you learn a language? I'm sure many people ask this question very early on, right? You ask this to yourself, and then you just move on basically with learning. Anyone would like to speak up? What are the main reasons you would choose to learn a foreign language? A second language or a third language? Yeah?
I think, why do I learn a language? Probably because I like the interaction with the people I do not know and about their cultural differences and kind of like embrace the differences between us and know that like deeply to know each other that we are different, not just by our language, but like in cultural differences in our learning style, our environmental differences are totally different.
That's a great motivation, yeah. Indeed, when you learn someone's language, you sort of open the door into their world, right? And language is a great tool to connect, but language also a huge barrier. And learning that language is, of course, your bridge and your door into that world. Often, and I know that I'm also part of the problem. When we live in a heavily English-speaking environment, a lot of voices that are not English-speaking, they get filtered out. Yeah, so I work currently at the public radio, Radio Taiwan International, and I have a show there, and I will talk about it a little bit later. And I interview guests who are Taiwanese voices, and they present their languages, many languages, on my show. And one of the problems we have there is that I have to find people who speak English, of course, because I'm in the English language department of the radio station. And that, of course, adds this very problematic filter that people who do not speak English won't be able to come and share as fluently and as many thoughts and opinions as people who are fluent in English would. And that's one of these problems, and I think it's a great motivation, thank you so much, to learn a language. Now, today I would like to offer a different look at the language learning motivation. And I don't know if perhaps some of you have dealt with this too, but this was definitely the reason why I've learned most of the languages that I've learned. And that is language as the tool of empowerment, language as the tool to seek out your own identity, language as the tool to feel confident about yourself. And just to give you a little background about myself, so these colored countries are countries that my life is somewhat connected to. Now we're in Taiwan, right? But there's this country here. Who knows what country this is? One of the stans, right? It's Uzbekistan, right? Uzbek, I think, in Mandarin or something like that. That's where I was born. It's an unusual location to be born in if you're a Korean Ukrainian, right? That is Ukraine. No, it's like this. This blue one here is Ukraine. Now this is Uzbekistan. I was born there in 1985, so it was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, right, USSR. Now there's a history behind this. These are my ancestors, and these are not typical Ukrainian people you will see on TV, right? We're actually Korean Ukrainians. I know Aaron mentioned this earlier. We're Korean Ukrainians, but we're not associated with South Korea or North Korea. Our history goes back a little bit further. And that all, well, basically what happened is at some point, a lot of Koreans started moving out into these areas of back then Russian Empire. And that is because Japan started sort of colonizing Korea at that moment. It wasn't a full-scale colonization yet at the end of the 19th century. But many Koreans moved into Russia specifically to stage anti-Japanese resistance. But then in 1937, when it was already Soviet Union in Russia, and they started increasing their control over that part of the Soviet Empire, they moved 172,000 Koreans into Central Asia. Central Asia is where Soviet government liked to move people to. Of course, it's forcible. People don't choose to do that. And all these people were moved in trains like this. You can see these are not passenger trains. These are cattle trains for cattle, basically, or for cargo. And about 1/3 of people either died during the transportation, which only took 1 month and happened in extremely cold weather of fall through winter. And many people died afterwards, after arriving in this unknown land of Central Asia, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. So I was born there, and then in 1990s, we moved to Ukraine, to this part of Ukraine called Kherson. I will just very quickly show you some of the images that we have from that place so you have better understanding. I know many people know Ukraine from the news, but too few people, sadly, know this image of Ukraine. This is the Black Sea coast, and these are our deserts and our natural reserves. We have zebras, I know, that's probably unusual. This is not their natural habitat. This is a national natural reserve, so we brought them actually from somewhere else. Not the best thing to do, but they've been there for decades now, so we're quite proud of them. And then we have this beautiful, we call it the Grand Canyon of Ukraine. And then, of course, we're a watermelon province. My family also grows watermelons. It's one of those things that Koreans in Ukraine do. Now, a lot of Koreans moved out of Central Asia and moved to Ukraine, specifically to do farming, because most of these people, well, lived most of their lives restricted from, positions of power, restricted from receiving higher education. So they ended up doing what they did best for generations, which was farming. And then we have a lot of Korean culture presence in southern Ukraine. Now you understand that when people ask me if I'm from South Korea or North Korea, there's no answer to that, because in 1937, or in the end of 19th century, when my ancestors moved out of Korean Peninsula, there was no North or South Korea, there was just one Korea. Korean Empire back then, and Korean Kingdom earlier. Now, what is my first language? Can you try to guess? Sadly, not Korean. Russian. Yeah.
No, I said Ukraine. Yeah.
No, it's actually Russian. Yeah, it's actually Russian. And that's quite a difficult situation to explain to people not familiar with our history, right? How come me, a Korean Ukrainian kid who was born in Uzbekistan, who had never visited Russia even for a day in his life, and then spent his whole life in Ukraine, only had Russian language as the only language in the family that he could speak until he was 7. And then, of course, has to do with our history. And this is also another thing that I wish more people knew about when they talk about Ukraine. So recently, I think this is from last year. So in February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. We say invaded again. And this was in 2023. I prepared this slide. And this is a very popular phrase that Ukrainians were using back then. Sort of when the whole world was commemorating the first anniversary of the war, as they say, Ukrainians used to say this: it's been 1 year since the beginning of the 9-year-long war that lasted for centuries. Now you get the 1-year reference. Now it's been almost 2.5 years. 9-year-long, that's the reference to the occupation of Crimea in 2014. But what is centuries, really? People don't know about the centuries, right? When did this all start? Now, Russia first started colonizing Ukraine in the 17th century. That's, in the medievals, and then later in the new modern times, there was, at least from the standpoint of today, we talk about expansionism and colonialism as something normal at that time. And indeed, Russians were also proud of it, like every other European power. They would say, we have colonies overseas. And it was okay to say that because it was cool. It was fashionable to have a colony, right? Everyone wanted to have a colony. But that's, of course, from the standpoint of a country that was colonizing. Now, there were all these numerous peoples, and here you can see them in color. Not all of them are actually colored here, who were not from the core. They were not from the center, right? They were not Russians. And Ukrainians were one of them here. Indigenous peoples of the Far East as well, right? And even if we take a look at Russia today, the red areas here are the ethnic minority areas, or parts of Russia which were granted some sort of autonomy under the Russian Federation Constitution. Of course, we understand that Russia doesn't really have proper federal autonomy as a normal federation would have. Now, this would give you a sense of Russia being a colonial empire that is normally not talked about, right? So in our textbook understanding of colonialism, we have this very typical, UK, France, Spain, US, colonial empires that established, typical colonies that we can think of. Settlers go over the ocean, establish a colony, start extracting resources, kill a bunch of people, right? They don't necessarily look like what Russia used to do. But in many aspects, they actually did. And of course, I won't be talking about everything that happened throughout this 400 years. But one of them is linguistic erasure, which happened across many colonies across the world, right? We know that most of Latin America is now Spanish-speaking or Portuguese-speaking. Same about North America, that is predominantly English or French-speaking. Now, Ukraine's fallen into this trap as well. And starting with the 1700s, Russia started imposing policies against Ukrainian language, or as they called it back then, small Russian language. Or Ukrainians would often call them Russinian language or Rus language. And this continued for a long time. As you can see, the list is quite long, and I'm sure it's not even full. Are we skipping a century here? No. And then this is from the Ukrainian Voices in Taiwan post that one of my colleagues here, Tao Liren, actually translated into Mandarin. So we do have Mandarin here, thanks to him. This beautiful letter, it's letter G. Now, it's a very normal sound for Mandarin, right, or for English. We use this like gu, for example. So G. For Ukrainians, this is quite a difficult sound to pronounce. Most of the time, we just pronounce H. So you'll hear people talking about Lady Gaga, calling her Lady Haha. That's because this letter was banned for almost 60 years by the Russian government, by the Soviet Russian government. So in 1933, there was an attempt within the Soviet Union to sort of centralize power across the Soviet Empire. And one of the ways to do that was to, of course, attack the identity and culture of the strongest of its parts, the strongest of its colonies, which was Ukraine. Ukraine had the strongest nationalist movement back then. Ukraine proclaimed independence once in 1917, along with Belarus, but both failed because Russia reinvaded again. And in 1933, Russia imposed a set of rules that aimed to bring Ukrainian language as close to Russian as possible. And a part of that was banning this letter. So we often now say that this letter is symbolic of the Ukrainian people because it got banned, but then it sort of found its way. Only in 1990s, Ukraine officially reinstated this letter. Now we have this in our alphabet. Now we use it to transliterate many things, including Mandarin words, into Ukrainian because we need that G sound. But the fact is, it's a very rarely used letter because it came out of usage. Very few words have this letter, and many people don't bother pronouncing it even. Speaking of Ukrainian voices, by the way, if you're ever curious, do check out. We have community events, and we do some online posts. Not as actively recently, sadly, but we still promote Ukrainian voices and Ukrainian narratives within Taiwan. Now, this is probably a very long part, but to make it very short, and I know you're updated on this whole conversation, this history that I just mentioned, and not just the erasure of Ukrainian language, but also the erasure of Ukrainian identity and culture, in addition to the physical aggression, very brutal, medieval-like aggression that is happening right now, is the reason why Ukraine is resisting. So these are some of the images of Ukrainians who are resisting. A huge portion, at least 1/5 of Ukraine's defense capability is filled by women in all sorts of positions, and then, of course, volunteers and soldiers and ethnically diverse groups as well. So the guy on the bottom left is also a Korean Ukrainian. He's the governor of Mykolaiv province, and he's one of the most prominent leaders of Ukraine's resistance today. And something that we also do in Taiwan here is we, of course, promote and fundraise for Ukraine, and we remind about Ukraine. With this war, as well as with the war that started in 2014, and even earlier for some parts of Ukraine, people in Ukraine started realizing the importance of their language. And perhaps when I was a kid, this wasn't really a big deal. I grew up in a rural southern Ukrainian village, and it was very normal to perceive Ukrainian as a language of, uneducated. It's the language of villagers. It's a language that you wouldn't, let's say, use to type a text message online. When we started using messengers, when people started getting internet and computers, we would all type in Russian. And no one really knew how to properly type in Russian. Everyone did type. Russian is an extremely difficult language, right? We could speak it, but we weren't educated really properly. And in the community, we spoke a mix of Russian and Ukrainian, which was back then perceived as the stage between a full Russian-speaking environment and, whatever of the Ukrainian language we had preserved. So it was on the way of erasing the Ukrainian language. Now we perceive that mix as the opposite, as an attempt to reclaim Ukrainian language. And I feel like with the first invasion to a lesser extent, but with this invasion that happened 3 years ago, more Ukrainians started speaking Russian. So these days, I don't know a single Ukrainian in Taiwan with whom I would be conversing in Russian language. And that is something very normal today. We just started using Ukrainian language. And I know for people from outside Ukraine, it's probably very different. Like, how do you even push yourself to do that? You will also see Ukrainians who talk to their other Ukrainian friends in Russian if they are from a Russian-speaking family. But if someone asks them, someone who's not Ukrainian, do you speak Russian? They will say no. They will pretend, because they don't want people to think that Ukrainians' first language is Russian. That is because we have the Ukrainian language that we now realize is more important than ever to everything that we hold dear. So that's how we've transitioned to Ukrainian language. Now, I don't know if there's going to be any people who will ever try to learn Ukrainian, but it's a very beautiful language. People often ask me if it's related to Russian. They are. They're both from the so-called Eastern branch of the Slavic language Slavic language group of the Indo-European languages. But if you see from this map, this is Ukrainian here, this is Russian. Ukrainian is most closely related to Belarusian here, sharing a lot of words with Polish. Now this is a lexical distance, so grammar-wise, Ukraine is still classified within the same group with Russian, but lexically Ukrainian is very close to Polish and closest to Belarusian. I can read texts in Belarusian. Now Ukrainian is, I don't know if you know, Ukrainian uses a Cyrillic-based script, the one on the left. Right, so letters are quite different from the Latin-based scripts like Polish on the right. And Ukrainian has its very unique alphabet, so please memorize this because I'll be testing you on the next slide, just for fun. There are some letters that Ukrainian has that Russian doesn't have, and some of them no other language has. So one of them is the G, right, the one I showed you previously, the letter survivor. And then we have this ye letter that looks like the euro sign, which is interesting because euro in Ukrainian is yevro. And then we have e, which is I with a dot and with two dots, that is ye, like in naive. And then we use apostrophe a lot. Would you like to give it a try? We'll see a written text in many languages. And I'll ask you to identify Ukrainian here. I'll give you 30 seconds. Okay, so number one. What language is that? Is that Ukrainian? No, right? There's not too many dots in this kind of things over the text. That's Bulgarian. Bulgaria is the country where they actually invented the Cyrillic alphabet within the territory of modern-day Bulgaria. Now the second one. Russian. I heard someone saying that. Yeah, that is Russian. Now the third one is clearly not Ukrainian, right? That is Polish. The fourth one, Belarusian, yes, Belarusian. And number 5, Ukrainian, yeah. I think here we're pretty much clear that number 5 is Ukrainian. Number 6 is, I think, either Czech or Slovak, I don't remember. And number 7 is Kazakh. Now, Kazakh is not even a Slavic language, but they also use, at least on practice, the Cyrillic-based alphabet up to date, also consequence of the Russian influence and colonialism. Now they're officially transitioning towards Latin-based alphabet. Now, number 5 is Ukrainian, because we can see that I with a dot, right? And we can see even one I with 2 dots, which is yi. We don't have the G here once again because that's quite a rare letter. And Ukrainians pride themselves on the fact that their language, our language, is very melodic. And I know many languages say that they're quite melodic. Ukrainian has a scientific base behind this, and that is vowel to consonant harmony. Now, I know many people think that most Slavic languages are hard to learn because they have a lot of consonants put together, like, right? And you just don't know where there are any vowels. So in Ukrainian language, we balance them just so that the flow is a little bit more balanced. So for example, the preposition in Ukrainian can be either v, which is a consonant, or u, which is a vowel. So if the noun then starts with a consonant, I would use u, like in to Kyiv. Wait, it means both to and in, depending on the case. So if you say to Kyiv, you would say u Kyiv. But if you say to Odessa, you would say v Odessu, right? And then many words like teacher or politeness or respect, those words would have two forms based on, the position within the sentence or words that are near it. And same about the pair of I and Y. For example, we are going. You can say idemo or you can say idemo. And same about the word Ukraine. Ukraina can also be called Vkraina. In Taiwan, u Taiwani, but in Austria, v Avstrii. So you can see balances the flow. But I'm not here only to talk about the Ukrainian language, because there's another language in my life that at some point I had to reclaim, and that is, of course, Korean, right? Are there any people who learn Korean? No. No, this is going to be challenging. Now, my province in Ukraine used to have, before the war at least, one of the highest Korean populations. So this is an annual Korean festival that happens across Ukrainian cities. And in 2018, it happened in my province for the second time, I think. And the Korean people who lived in the Soviet Union, they were often restricted from, being able to access. So basically, when Koreans got deported from Far East into Central Asia, the Soviet government tasked them with developing the rice industry of the Central Asia. Now, if you know about Uzbekistan or southern Kazakhstan, these are currently huge producers of cotton and rice. But it wasn't always like that. It was quite a barren land. It's desert, There's only 2 rivers in the area, and they're all drying out. So when Koreans were forcibly moved to that area, they were tasked by the Soviet government to form this collective farm, Soviet-style farms, and start producing rice and cotton. And Koreans were quite good at it, so they became very quickly the model minority, the most respected minority in the area, because they were so hardworking. But model minority is actually not a good thing. That means that you were capable to, let's say, shut up and work, right? And of course, we were one of the most quickly assimilated ethnic minorities in the area. Now, my grandpa already, who was still born in Korea, he grew up with a Russian name. His name was Sergei Shyn. Shyn being the Korean last name, the same as mine. But his name was Sergei. And then, of course, after him, everyone who was born, they carried Russian first names. Many Koreans converted to Orthodox Christianity very quickly. And many Koreans were just not even trying to, rediscover their roots, because that was discouraged. And, as very passionate East Asian mentality people would do, they tried to, very quickly comply and only cared about the good life. I'm sure Taiwanese people maybe can understand if we're talking about older generations of people who would prioritize family well-being and financial situation over some of the principles that might bother them And for us, that was language, and to a huge extent, our culture, which is part of the reason why I grew up Russian-speaking up until I went to elementary school. But we do have a very beautiful dialect of Korean language that is called Koryo dialect. And we're actually one of I think the only subgroup of the Korean people who call themselves with a word that sounds like Korea, which is Koryo. Because, in South Korea, Korea is Hanguk, Hanguo, right? Hanguk. Then in North Korea and in China, they call themselves what? Choson, Chosen, right? Choson. Now we call ourselves Koryo, and then South Korea would be Nam Koryo, and then North Korea would be Buk Koryo, right? And of course, no one knows how to write it. We all just use Russian alphabet, and only a limited vocabulary got preserved. So I'm gonna very quickly test you. I know, because I know many Taiwanese people watch Korean drama, right? Some part of Korean vocabulary probably can identify words. Now, this one I already told you, Koryo or Kori is how we say Korea, right? So Korimae would be Korean language, or Kori Sarami would be Korean people. Now, what would this be? Abai. I feel like people who speak Taiwanese, Dai, maybe can identify this word. Someone within the family, right? Whom would you call Abai? Oh, it means ugly in Taiwanese.
Ugly?
Oh, no.
Oh, you like abe. That mean like elder, uncle?
Yeah, uncle. I think that's a cognate.
Right.
That's probably a cognate, a related word. Abai means grandpa. Yeah. Yeah, in South Korea, they, haraboji, right? It's a very different word. And then Amya, Abai's wife, right? Grandma. In South Korea, it would be halmoni. Now, what is kimchi? Kimchi, very good. Now, in Koryo dialect, and as well as in Choson communities in China, they call kimchi chimchi, which is very interesting. And what is this phrase? Iropsa. Iropsa. Now, I was hoping if there were some people who were learning Korean would probably be able to identify this word. Now, iropsa is our word for South Korean 괜찮아. It's okay, 괜찮아. But the etymology here is very interesting because iropsa, if you understand it from the South Korean dialect point of view, it literally means no work or no event, no incident. 일 없어. And very close to the Mandarin, 没事, right? It's okay, 没事. 일 없어, yeah, it's a nothing. That's how we say we're okay, 일 없어. Now, so I started learning, obviously not my dialect, but the South Korean dialect when I was a teenager because I always felt like I wasn't complete, without that part of my identity. I remember when I was a kid, I went to, there was this summer camp in Western Ukraine, and it was organized by the Ukrainian, it's like a public body that regulates ethnic minorities and cultures, not regulates, but promotes the interethnic communication. And they gathered kids from across Ukraine, from different ethnic backgrounds. And then every group, they got their day within this summer camp program they were organizing, teaching people songs, cooking the food, and all that. And there were quite a bunch of Korean kids like me, but we didn't have a day of our own. Simply because we couldn't teach the language, we didn't know much of the culture, we would just explain something to people, but there was not enough, to fill the whole day. And we didn't know which anthem to play when everyone was playing anthems, because what are we going to play, South Korean anthem? Does that really, And of course that coincided with the Korean wave. So when I was a teenager, Korean music started popping up everywhere, Korean drama and so on. And I started learning South Korean when I was 15. And I was doing it in the time when materials in Ukrainian or Russian were quite limited. So I remember stealing books from the Google and printing them at print shops, which is clearly illegal. And I learned Korean like this, and then I ended up going to South Korea to study. After high school, I graduated, and I went to South Korea, and it was a dream come true. I was the first person in 3 generations to visit Korea. Korean Peninsula, in fact. My parents were so proud. And for me, it was a big deal. Yeah, it was pretty much a return home. Yeah, and it was a fulfillment. I felt good. But of course, you know, as always a diaspora kid returning to a country that's changed so much from the grandparents' generation, there's always this honeymoon period and then the cultural shock stage. That all happened to me, part of the reason why I'm here. But that was an important step in my education and my sort of realization in my life. But then, of course, my obsession with languages didn't stop there. I went ahead and I started studying, I don't know, I feel like, because I studied political science, but most of the coursework, I just spent it learning languages. I would sign up for all kinds of courses. I did 6 semesters of Spanish. I did Egyptian Arabic. I did Latin, Finnish, Biblical Hebrew, then I wrote my thesis about linguistic policy, because at that point, I felt like it has to go somewhere from there. It has to crystallize into something meaningful than just hoarding languages. So I wrote a thesis about language policy in Ukraine and Belarus and how it's different. So Belarus is our closest neighbor, right, to the north. Now they're, of course, the allies to Russia. But ethnically, culturally, they're closest to Ukraine. And I was really curious, how does that happen that we have such different linguistic situations? Ukraine reclaimed its language, but Belarus pretty much lost it. Now in Belarus, if you speak Belarusian on the street, you're considered what? An opposition. And that is a very bad word in Belarus because it's a dictatorship, right? It's not a democracy, so they don't have a proper opposition. That means they are enemy of the state. That is a very severe situation, and I'm sure many Taiwanese people can relate because Taiwan had its own history of cultural erasure and oppression, right, for many decades before. Not the same, but similar. And I did that, and then I went ahead and I studied education policy, and I did a research on indigenous language education policy in Taiwan. And that was sort of my first encounter with Taiwan from this very standpoint. I know many foreigners who come to Taiwan and do academic work. They come from Chinese studies, right? They either studied in Beijing or Shanghai, or they studied China studies in their home countries, and then they come to Taiwan and then they realize there's more to this. My first encounter with anything related to first Mandarin language was through Taiwan, but with that, of course, came understanding of how diverse Taiwan really is. And that's where a huge part of my interest lies, is Taiwan's linguistic diversity. Now, I don't throw parallels at Taiwan and Ukraine. A lot of people like to do that, especially when they talk about war. But I do think there are meaningful parallels when we talk about more deeper things and more meaningful things, like, for example, language or identity or language loss or cultural erasure, and of course, reclamation, revitalization, and so on. So yeah, I think if you've seen the poster, there's, I don't know, Aaron, why do we have all the universities that I've been to listed on the poster? But yeah, the journey has been quite exciting in that I visited many countries. I lived in Lebanon and I studied Levantine Arabic there, which is not the same with Egyptian Arabic. They're quite different. And after all that, of course, I did my research on Taiwan. And that's a huge part of what I do today. Now, I always try to think of Taiwanese people as people who probably speak more languages than we assume. Right? Is that true? For how many people is that true? If we're only speaking about languages of Taiwan. Yeah, Taiwanese. So here I specifically put Taiwanese languages, not Formosan languages. Those are not the same, right? Taiwanese languages are all the languages that we speak in this beautiful country. Now, Formosan languages would only be Taiwanese indigenous languages. But this is a huge topic that I've been curious about, and I did my master's research about this, and then I came here to continue this work. And a lot of that interest lies specifically in Austronesian or Formosan, well, Austronesian largely, and Formosan languages within Taiwan, which are Taiwan's indigenous languages, because I think that's a huge treasure, a very important heritage of Taiwan's culture and history. And I've given you fun facts about Ukrainian and Koryo dialect of Korean, so I don't know if you already know this, but this could be a fun fact too. Austronesian languages are as geographically scattered as you can see on this map, right? So from Madagascar to the east, to Rapa Nui of Chile here, to Hawaii, to Maori people in New Zealand. Now, Taiwan is colored here in a different color. That is because within this family of languages, there's also divisions, right? So Austronesian languages have about 8 to 9 language groups. And all of the red color from Madagascar all the way to Rapa Nui, which is like half the world pretty much, that is all only one group. What do you mean?
It's like Taiwan scattered all the languages from
Yeah.
Taiwan. So, like, for
Yeah.
example, Maui has Banzad's language because they can actually speak to each other. I think there's like news about it.
Yeah, that's one of the hypotheses, and there's a lot of evidence that supports it. It's called out of Taiwan theory, right? That all Austronesian languages came out of Taiwan. Now, that's still a hypothesis, sadly, but I think that's pretty solid. And I also like the idea. I think one of the reasons why I believe this is because, as I was saying, all the red-colored countries, their languages are one language group, while Taiwan contains the remaining 8. In fact, Taiwan contains all of them, because one part of Taiwan here is still colored in red. Do you see which part? The Orchid Island, right? Orchid Island, so the Tao people of Orchid Island, or Yami, which is a Japanese word, so we try not to use that, but probably most people know them as Yami. Tao people, they speak a language that is more related to the Philippines, Tagalog, to Maori and to Malagasy of Madagascar than it is to their nearest neighbors who are Pangta in Taidong, right? And that I think is fascinating because Taiwan pretty much has all the 8 or 9 language groups within its territory, while all the other ones are just related to the people of the Orchid Island. And I think that is something that should be more discussed internationally. And this is the linguistic map of only indigenous peoples. Now, we know that only between 2.5% to 5% of Taiwan's population are of indigenous heritage. And I'm saying between 2.5% and 5% is because, a lot of Pingpu people are not recognized yet, right? The Plains indigenous peoples. And we don't really know because a lot of people also assimilated or got mixed together. Some people say that most Taiwanese people now have some indigenous Taiwanese Formosan blood in them, right? Which all are very interesting discussions. But I think, let's think about, let's say, Slavic language group. Okay, let's choose something more familiar. Let's talk about the Germanic languages, right? So which languages are part of the Germanic language group? We have English, right? A weird case, but English, German, Dutch, all the languages of the north, well, not all, Norwegian, Swedish, Icelandic, right? All these languages are a part of one language group. Now, here you can see groups within Taiwan. So you can see that, for example, Puyuma here. Puyuma, I think now we call them Pinuyumayan. Pinuyumayan language here, this small cluster in Taidong, is as far from, genealogically, is as far from Rukai, Paiwan, Bunun, or Amis as German is to, let's say, Spanish, roughly speaking, because they're not even within the same language group. And you can see that we have these clusters a lot, and that's thanks to Taiwanese mountains, of course, right? And that very Rukai there is a very unique language, and Paiwan. Now, these are not monolith languages, of course. There are huge dialectal continuums within these groups. Paiwan itself has about, 4 to 5 dialects. But these are so unique that I think is why so many more scientists are coming to Taiwan these days to research this topic. And well, I'm going to be one of them soon. In September, I'm starting my PhD in indigenous studies in Donghua Daxue. I'm really excited about it, although I know it's going to be very stressful. I still don't know what is the perception of indigenous, the degree of understanding of indigenous linguistic landscape among Taiwanese people generally. But I know outside of Taiwan, very few people know about this. And I think this is a very interesting topic that should be discussed more. Another interesting topic, of course, is larger Taiwanese linguistic diversity, which includes, of course, at least 5 or 6 dialects of Dai, right? We know that about 80% of Taiwan's population have Dai heritage, which is very significant. Dai heritage from, how do I say that? I know there's a word Hoklo, right? But that's a Hakka word well, there's also Hakka, right? 10 to 11% of the population. And that is very interesting. And that I brought that interest to this place, Radio Taiwan International. I started working for them first because they opened a Ukrainian language department. Now, Radio Taiwan International has 20 language departments. The newest one was added last year. That's Malay. Our biggest is Indonesian, obviously, with the huge Indonesian population present in Taiwan. And I was heading the Ukrainian department when they also asked me if I wanted to design a program specifically for the English department. And I said, of course, let's do this and let's talk about what do they speak in Taiwan. And then I know I'm not a super creative person, you can see from the logo and the title, but I put a lot of heart into this because that is the main question that people ask me when they're curious about Taiwan. And I think there's not enough resources to explain the answer to these people because simply there's no easy answer, right? Currently, Taiwan has an N number of official national languages. By N, I mean the law doesn't even define the list, right? We know that according to the definition within the National Languages Act of Taiwan, every language that is significantly is also a blurred kind of formulation, is spoken in the country, not only spoken but also signed, is official. So that makes, of course, dialects of Taiwanese, Hakka, all the indigenous languages and dialects official. Also Taiwanese Sign Language, which, fun fact, is more closely related to Japanese Sign Language than it is to Mandarin, the China Sign Language. Yeah. And on this show, I decided to do exactly that, invite people who either speak or study or learn various languages of Taiwan, and they're willing to talk about this to our international audience. And these are icons from our season 1. We've covered 5 languages. We've covered Tai twice because that's a very significant language for Taiwan. And most of the time when I invite people, regardless of whether they are indigenous Taiwanese or if they are from the Dai speaking heritage or Hakka speaking heritage, a lot of the things that they say, I can understand very easily. When people say something like, my parents didn't teach me this language because they wanted me to be happy, they wanted me to succeed. Now that sounds sad, but that makes so much sense, right? Because in the environment in which my parents grew up, my grandparents grew up, and perhaps your parents and grandparents grew up, or you yourself perhaps have been a part of, that history of Taiwan, speaking other languages than Mandarin Chinese was not the best strategy to succeed in life. And it might not look like we're still living in that environment, but it actually is still the case for many people in Taiwan, especially indigenous communities. Many of them are still asking themselves whether or not they're willing to educate their children to at least, understand their language. Now it is clear they won't be able to really use this language for their life and work and entirely surround themselves in a language that is spoken, let's say, only by 500 people, like Kanakanavu, for example. But they are still asking themselves whether or not it's even worth to dedicate 1 hour of their child's curriculum time to learn their ancestral language. But I think the consequence of that is quite obvious, losing a whole language, and in Taiwan's case, a huge part of its heritage, which people from across the world are coming here to talk about and to hear about and to ask people about. And I didn't prepare a conclusion here. As you can see, we've just covered a lot of things here. But let it be this. I just hope that in Taiwan we can view language not just merely as a tool of achieving something economically or career-wise or professionally, but also a tool for many people living among us who see language as a tool of empowerment, a tool of reclaiming their confidence, a way for them to feel fulfilled and whole in this society. One of my interview guests once said this very interesting question. You're a foreigner, speaking to me. You're a foreigner, so if you just learn one word in Paiwan, everyone will applaud you. But I am a Paiwan myself. And if I cannot properly speak Paiwan, the mainstream society will think that I'm not fully an indigenous person. Now you can see that discrimination and all kinds of twisted perceptions of people still persist. And even in environments where we think that people are actually empowered by the law or its implementation, we still have situations where people have to double think themselves or navigate this difficult system in order to be really confident about first of all, their ancestral language and culture, secondly, about their identity, thirdly, about this very difficult journey of actually learning your ancestral language. That's something that I went through, at least once. This microphone is getting tired of me. Thank you. At least once with the Korean language, but of course I had to reclaim Ukrainian for myself as well. With that, thank you so much. I think we have still a lot of time left, at least 30 minutes. So let's take all the questions you have, in English or otherwise. I think if Aaron would be kind enough to translate for me if there's any questions in Mandarin, I would also love to hear them.
My name is Shyn, and my question is not too sensitive. I want to ask about your opinion about Taiwan's bilingual country 2030. So it actually, by bilingual, it means Chinese and English. And I think it's actually not that intuitively logical because Taiwan has never been a English-speaking island. So I wonder what do you think about this policy?
That's a very relevant question. I feel like a lot of conversation, especially in the circles where I'm in, talk about this, right? How do we call a new policy bilingual if both languages are actually, either came to this island at some point recently, or are just one of many languages people actually speak? So I think in official formulation it's called bilingual language policy, and people actually speak more than 2 languages here, even if they're very good at English. I understand where it comes from, of course. In Ukraine also does that. People are trying to integrate their country and their society into the global system. The world is globalized. And many people are actually making this choice today, while they already speak Mandarin, of course, the language of the majority, absolute majority in Taiwan. Whether or not they should invest resources and time to learn their ancestral language that extremely needs learning and supporting and revitalization, or they should just send their child to a bushiban, there's so many of them in Taiwan, and make sure that their kids learn a very relevant and useful language that is English and succeed in life and maybe earn more money than if they went ahead to learn their ancestral language. That's a relevant question. I actually have to ask you what you think about it. For me, it feels very counterintuitive, first of all, in the way that it's named, because if all the Taiwanese people manage to speak English fluently, I think for the majority, it wouldn't be a bilingual policy. It would be already a tri- or quadrilingual policy. Secondly, I think that a policy like this should come in parallel with reinforcing the support for Taiwan's already existing many languages. That includes education. I know we have very good laws, some might say not as good laws supporting indigenous languages, Hakka, and then a general law for everything else. We have, I think, 3 major pieces of legislation in Taiwan. But they're not implemented as well. Many people who, even if they want their child to learn their ancestral language, they are going to school and they only spend 45 minutes of their time a week learning Hakka or learning Amis. That is, of course, not enough. And I'm not even talking about the quality of that education. And I'm not even talking about the quality of teacher education, teacher training, and of course, examination that is highly flawed in Taiwan examination and certification system. I feel like that all should be also at least equally prioritized when we're forcing greater English language education in Taiwan. So I only have those 2 points to give you. Otherwise, I'm more curious about what people actually think here. Yeah. That's a very relevant question, though.
So I have a very controversial question about indigenous people having a certificate, like you're saying. Without the certificate, the people have the clustering of indigenous people would have 1.25 of score, what do you call that, like a bonus? And if you have the certificate for the indigenous language, you're up to 1.35, and that becomes a discrimination in Taiwan, between peers. Oh, you are indigenous people, so you got 1.35. This is joking, but it's still a discrimination, in my opinion. For me, myself, I'm an Amis, but I didn't get in learning the language itself. So from my kind of perspective, I don't want that. I don't want that bonus. I still learn this for myself. I don't want that part to be an excuse for my learning that I contribute to this part, but then it got discriminated because I'm an indigenous person. That's my question.
Yeah, that's indeed a very complicated question. I think the main concept that we're dealing with here is affirmative action, right? And historical justice, when we're talking about bigger pictures. When within a society there's a group that's been disadvantaged for more than a generation or for a long time, as it's the case with Taiwan's indigenous peoples who've been here for thousands of years, but for most of their history, once other peoples arrived, they were subjected to discrimination and assimilation and oppression. Now, at some point occurs a need within the democratic society to balance it up back for the people who've been disadvantaged, right? So I think at least the idea behind this policy to grant indigenous students who pass their language examination a chance to sort of give them a boost to a larger population, give a boost within the system of education and further in career and professional life, and to make sure that they have a little bit more chance to getting into the positions within the society which they would have occupied if historical injustice didn't happen to them, right? Now, even with those quotas, I think we're not really fixing the whole situation. But that might provide some people who are coming from backgrounds, that people who cannot afford a good bushiban, people who cannot afford to go through all those mentoring and tutoring and cycles. This industry in Taiwan is extremely developed, where you just go from one place to another to prepare for exams. Not all people can afford that. So this would give you first an opportunity to actually occupy a certain place there, which would have, if you weren't from a community that's collectively been disadvantaged. Secondly, wait, I just lost my point. Secondly, to encourage the population, the people to learn their ancestral language, right? So I feel like we're tackling two problems at once. Now there's a lot of discussion to whether or not that's effective, but I think at least the design behind this policy is that. And I totally understand why some people would choose, some indigenous people especially, would choose not to take that opportunity, even if they wanted to learn or reclaim their ancestral language, because they would want to avoid, right, this discrimination. I think a lot of people are motivated by that, but you would also need to come from a certain place of privilege to be able to say no to an opportunity that is given to you for free, you know what I mean? And I think people who really need that, they would take it. Otherwise, people would say no to that, and that only makes sense. But I think, and this was said by one of my guests, she's from Pinu Yumayan, and she studied communications. She studied communications, and then she started working at this very top media agency in Taiwan as a TV host and international reporter. She speaks amazing English. She speaks many languages. She's relearning Pinu Yumayan. And she said, I didn't go to work at TITV. You know TITV? Taiwanese Indigenous Television. She said, I didn't go to work there. You know why? Because I don't want people to say, you're indigenous, that's why you went there. Probably got a job easily because you're already indigenous. And she said, no, I want people to know that I've come here because we are indigenous people and we're everywhere. Because we're talented, we can also achieve things. So we go, to a regular TV. I go here and we go there, and we have experts everywhere. There's also people like that who, of course, they challenge the system and they challenge the discrimination, the added discrimination that you mentioned. And I think it's also a huge discussion in Taiwan. Yeah, but I think the system of affirmative action should still be there for people who genuinely need it. Yeah. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Shelley, and when I saw your PPT about the Auckland's characters, I cannot help but think about Taiwanese character, because nowadays Taiwanese people want to preserve Taiwanese language, so we start to create new character of Taiwanese. I just want to ask you about your opinion, or did you find any other indigenous people who try to create new characters of their own language? Is it work, or is it hard, or what do you see? It's my question. Thank you.
I can talk about these things for hours. That's my favorite topic. Languages come first. Spoken languages, and then written systems, right? So, because many languages, they got, even if they've suffered from, extreme oppression throughout their speaking communities, throughout the history, they might preserve the spoken language, but they might not preserve the written language. That's a huge problem, because the written language opens up a door to education policy, to publishing, books and everything, media, communications. That's the case for many languages, not just indigenous, for many languages like Taiwanese or Ukrainian at some point. Ukrainian some 100 years ago also struggled from not having a standardized written form. That is because Ukraine didn't have its own authority over its language. So as I exemplified earlier, Russia just tweaked the alphabet the way they wanted, not just alphabet, the grammar, the punctuation, whatever rules associated with the Ukrainian language. You can do that if you have authority over other language. Now, the situation with, I would say, all languages of Taiwan that I can think of, except for Mandarin Chinese, is that there is a lack of a written standard form. Interestingly, the only language that has a very solid ground for its written form is Shiraya. Shiraya, the language that Shiraya people are one of the so-called, which is not really a correct term, right? Pingpu people, indigenous people of the plains. They live mostly in Tainan or area around Tainan and Kaohsiung. And unlike all the other indigenous people, they had their language written down at some point by the Dutch. I wouldn't call them missionaries. I think one very respected scientist said they were clerics, but not missionaries per se. And they were in fact colonizers, right? So what they did is when they tried to convert the Shiraya people, but also indigenous people living around that area, to Christianity, they wrote down their language, and they created a set of Bibles, bilingual Bibles, which is an amazing thing, because that actually helped to preserve the written tradition of the language. Some forms of the, I think, Taoyuan language, it's also called Tevoran language, is also spoken in that area, also got preserved thanks to Bibles. And then some of these Bibles, one of the Shiraya book of John, part of the Bible, was discovered in Europe, I think, by a great scientist, Christopher Joby, here. And he went all the way there, and he found it, and he said, guys, this actually belongs to Taiwan, because this is Shiraya language. And he brought the knowledge about it here. And now the Shiraya community is revitalizing their language based on that written language. And when you have a Bible translated into that language, it's very easy to reconstruct, relatively easy to reconstruct it, because Bible is the same thing, right? Pretty much the same thing everywhere. Now, I know most other Taiwanese languages don't have that privilege, including Tai, right? So the Ministry of Education put out a set of rules that would regulate the writing system for Taiwanese language. And there's no uniform Taiwanese system with this system, a uniform system within that set of rules. It suggests that you can use either Mandarin characters, and then they explain how to best use them. Chinese characters, sorry. Or you can use the TELL. TELL is Taiwanese romanization for Tai. Or you can mix both. They call it Hanle. So you mix Chinese characters with a romanization system. I, of course, don't have an opinion on which system is better. There are at least 3 schools of thought. I know there are more. and there's a lot of heated debate around it. Some people say that none of them works, and that the true system for Tai is PVG. I don't know if you know PVG. So basically Taiwanese was once also written by Christian missionaries, written down, and then the first, if I'm not wrong, the first periodic publication in Taiwan here in Formosa that was published, it was published in Taiwanese language using the PVG system. And it's a very beautiful system because they use basically Latin-based script, but it has a lot of tweaked things that help people to read it in Taiwanese way. It has all the tones. And of course, I don't have any opinion about which system is better. I think all of them are relevant. It makes perhaps a little bit easier for people like me who are not fluent in Mandarin Chinese to read Taiwanese that is written entirely in Latin-based letters, because that's a little bit more intuitive to me, but perhaps not to some other people. Yeah. But I think it's very important that there is an effort to come up with a uniform system, because once you have a written system, all the doors open up for you. You can enforce the rules, you can educate people how to write and read, you can publish books, and you can translate literature into it. Now I know many translators who translate world literature, let's say, into Tai. They have to deal with this problem. They have to choose a written system that they want to translate into. Some of them put both versions in one book, and some of them, some publishers I know, even require that you provide an audiobook with it, because they know that some of their readers don't know that specific written system or all of them. So they require an audiobook that comes with it. It's a very difficult situation, but there's a lot of effort from activists and from Minister of Education to fix that. Yeah. Thank you. I hope that answers.
Okay. Hi. I'm just curious, how long have you lived in Taiwan, and what was, I'd say, the biggest difference or the most prominent difference that you had observed among the language learning environment of among Taiwan and compared to Western countries?
Well, I don't have much to compare with, because while I was in Europe, my main working language was already English. I did my whole study program there in English. I did learn some German, and I already could speak some Spanish when I went to, let's say, Spain for my master's. But otherwise, I didn't really go through, regular classes or tutoring or anything. So one thing I noticed, though, when I was in Spain, I was in Barcelona, which some people might say is not Spain. And they had free classes for Catalan at my university. They were entirely free, but I only was there for 4 months. I would have taken them because Catalan is an extremely interesting language. It's more close to French, actually, than it is to Spanish or Castilian. And then if you wanted to learn Spanish, which probably most foreigners would prioritize while living in Barcelona, you had to pay. That was a very interesting system. In Taiwan, sadly, we have to pay for everything. I have done 3 rounds of Mandarin classes, and I'm trying to learn Taiwanese and Paiwan on my own, which is extremely difficult, especially learning Taiwanese if you don't already speak Mandarin, because that's a huge help, actually, if you can already speak Mandarin and you want to learn Taiwanese. But yeah, don't have much to compare, to be honest. But generally, I feel like in Taiwan, because, well, I think the main difference, let's compare with Korea. Because Korea, I lived 6 months in Korea, and 99% of the population, they speak Korean. They're Koreans, they identify as Koreans. They're culturally part of Korean culture. Taiwan is much more diverse, and I feel like Taiwanese people are also more open-minded about people who speak other languages. So that's how I've survived all this time with only speaking maybe upper elementary Mandarin all this time. because in Korea I wouldn't have. It would have been more difficult for me. Yeah. That probably doesn't answer your question, but
it's alright.
yeah.
You can't feel like a really striking comparison between like the Western society's learning environment of language and the Asian society.
Exactly, yeah. I know some people say that, they prioritize cramming in Taiwan or Korea or in Japan, and they prioritize more of free speaking in Western countries. But then again, I'm coming from Ukraine, which had to deal with the legacy of Soviet-style education. So we pretty much crammed our way through English from elementary school until graduation without people actually being able to speak it naturally by the time they graduate. Yeah, so in that regard, we're rather similar.
During your time in Korea, do you face a similar struggle that, for example, your indigenous friend is struggling learning his or her native language, facing their own community, and when you were in Korea, but you thought you are not so good in speaking Korean language, do you face the same struggle, or is there some stress from other local people because you look like Korean people?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Yes, that happened to me a lot. In fact, so basically from the area that we're talking about, a lot of, let's look at the map. So a lot of kids who are like me, ethnic Koreans from this whole area from Ukraine or Russia, Uzbekistan, they would go back, right, around the time when I went back to Korea to learn Korean language as a matter of, finding your roots. Now, we struggle with that because we're Russian speaking originally, right? And Russian is extremely different from Korean. But we also have a lot of students coming from Uzbekistan, the yellow one, who are Uzbek. They're ethnically Uzbek, and at home they speak Uzbek. And Uzbek is more close to Korean in terms of structure. You know how Korean is structured, you have a noun or a word, and then a lot of endings in the end. So for them, it's so much easier to learn Korean. So of course, people coming from Uzbekistan or from Turkey, they would master, or Japan, they would master Korean very easily. Same goes to Mandarin-speaking people because they know a lot of Hanzi, right? 65% of Korean language is Hanzi-based. And when I was in my language school in Korea, when I was learning Korean, I spent 1 year just going through language courses. That I always felt this kind of stress of being put, against people who are not of Korean blood, who have nothing to do with Korea, just the love for K-pop, and they would still be able to speak Korean better than me. And I would have this very horrible Ukrainian accent and pronunciation that is so different, and my sentence structure was wrong because, Korean and Japanese, they have all these verbs in the end, while Ukrainian language structure is actually closer to Chinese. We put most important thing first. And then because of that, my sentences all sound wrong, or I would start a sentence, I would go towards the middle of it, and then I lost the point, and then and Korean people would, of course, judge for that. For them, it's not enough to be considered Korean, to just think that you're Korean. You need to be able to speak the language. It's a very important thing in Korea, I feel like. And of course, I struggled with that. I used to double think myself. And that was also part of the reason, I think, why a lot of ethnic Koreans from overseas, diasporic Koreans who go to Korea, they eventually end up living it, or basically moving on, because at some point you realize that no, this is not the place that you can call home. In fact, it was never your home, right? but it was a very important step in your life to go through this. Yeah, and I also, to this day, I do not identify with South Korea as a country, let's say even number 2 after Ukraine, because I'm realizing that I'm not a South Korean, and it's very difficult for me to be associated with that country on this basis. Yeah. No matter how much I love the country, of course. Yeah.
In your experience, like you have already learned a lot of different languages, and how can you still preserve the ability of speaking like those different kind of language till now, even if you are not always in the same environment?
Well, the thing is, I don't. I think I don't speak any language fluently at this point. Sometimes I mix languages and I realize that if people who are back home hear me speaking this language, they would think that I'm not okay, that something is wrong with me. Yeah, that happens, I think. You end up just mixing languages, mixing words, and then, of course, you develop your own code. Like, for example, here, Ukrainians in Taiwan, we use a lot of Mandarin words that are very useful that we don't have in Ukrainian. Like, for example, mafan. You know, it's such a useful word. In English, you can say something like bother, right? Sorry for bothering you. But in Ukrainian, we don't really have this kind of word that carries this nuanced meaning. So in Ukrainian, I would say something like, why are you mafaning me again? You know, or like, oh, sorry for mafaning you again. Phrases like this, and it gets incorporated into our spoken language, but only, of course, here in Taiwan within this context. But if I go back to Ukraine, no one would know the value of this kind of code mixing. Yeah, that happens a lot. And then for my work, of course, I have to stick to either Ukrainian or English. That's sometimes challenging. And I think a lot of Ukrainians end up mixing in some English into their language. That happens a lot. I know many Taiwanese people also do that, right? Especially when you're talking about concepts that are very challenging or nuanced that you need to bring into your language, but you want to keep it exactly the same, with the same nuances. And I think that's normal, at least until your own language or that other language you're trying to speak develops a similar concept. It's okay to, as long as it helps your communication, I think it's fine. Yeah. And no, I don't speak all of them fluently, sadly. Thank you so much.
Okay, so let's give Oleg a big round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here.